everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Skeptical Inquirer Presents. My name is Bertha Vasquez. I'm the Director of Education here at the Center for Inquiry. And today's webinar is titled A Life Preserver for Staying Afloat in a Sea of Misinformation. Our wonderful guest is Melanie Trecek-King. She's an Associate Professor of Biology at Massasoit Community College in Massachusetts, where she loves teaching students who don't want to be scientists when they grow up. After years of teaching science as a body of facts to memorize, she designed a novel general education science course to teach critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy skills. These skills, not facts approach teaches students how, not what, to think, and equips them with the tools they need to make better decisions. Her passion for science education led her to create www.thinkingispower.com, which I've added to one of my sites, Melanie, an online resource that provides accessible and engaging critical thinking information to her students, the general public, and other educators. So today we're going to be talking about how in a world of misinformation, being able to critically evaluate claims is empowering. Good thinking is the best way to protect ourselves from being fooled or even harmed by misinformation. The problem is, where do we start? The necessary skills, critical thinking and science literacy, are kind of difficult to master and to apply. To address this issue today, we have Melanie Trecek-King, and I'm going to pass the microphone over to her. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, are you seeing my screen? All right, awesome. So I am so happy to be here. I am.
There it is.
Awesome. Okay. So yes, that's the hardest part of every Zoom talk, right? I'm really excited to talk about how to stay afloat in a sea of misinformation, because there's a lot of it. Several years ago, I was teaching intro bio, the course that most students who aren't science majors take. And I remember the moment really clearly. I was explaining the stages of mitosis, and in my attempt to make it relevant to students, I was applying it to the stages of cancer. And I looked out at my students and they were pretty bored. Honestly, I was too. Students who aren't science majors generally only take one science class, and they only do it because they have to, and they're not enthusiastic about doing it. And I didn't feel like I was helping. I love science though, and I love teaching students who don't want to be scientists when they grow up. Science influences every aspect of our lives, and gen ed science is our last chance to teach the average adult science literacy. But I had one semester and I felt like a lot of pressure, and worse, I felt like I was blowing my chance. So I asked myself, what are we doing here? Is science literacy memorizing facts? And I don't think so. I mean, facts are forgettable. I was recently talking to a college friend who's now a high school choral conductor. And he said the only thing that he remembered about intro bio in college was getting scolded for talking, I think, which says quite a bit. Facts are also look-upable. We carry in our pockets phones that have access to basically all of the world's information. And they also change. When I was in undergrad, there were 5 kingdoms. Now there's 3 domains. There was no epigenetics, and let's not even talk about Pluto. And more importantly, most importantly, science isn't just a body of facts. It's a way of knowing. It's how we know, and that's actually more important than what we know. So I wondered, can we do something different? Can we teach students how to think like scientists? The average person isn't going to be a research scientist, and that's okay, but they do need to know how to evaluate claims in their daily lives. And during the pandemic, we've all seen what happens when people who don't understand how the process of science works. So I decided I needed to start from scratch, blow the whole thing up. I searched for other approaches to non-major science. Thankfully, I found Matt Rowe and Marcus Gillespie's great Foundations of Science course at Sam Houston State, and they generously shared materials that were essential in the development of course that I now call Science for Life. And the goal of that class is to teach students skills to empower them to make better decisions, and hopefully do it in an engaging, accessible, and fun way, hence the fun colors and silly graphics. But the bottom line is that skills are more important than facts. So I have what I call the trilogy of skills. Critical thinking is the ability to draw reasonable conclusions from the available evidence. Information literacy is the ability to find, evaluate, and use information effectively. And science literacy is understanding how the scientific community produces scientific knowledge and the ability to use that knowledge to draw evidence-based conclusions and make informed decisions. I do want to put out a disclaimer. Yes, facts are important. Obviously, facts are important, but the process or how we know is more important than the content or what we know, especially for non-scientists. So the goal of Science for Life is to evaluate claims and not fall for misinformation. These are some of the current claims of misinformation. It's impossible to keep up with the fire hose of misinformation. And it's why skills are more important than facts. Otherwise, it'd be like playing whack-a-mole. Skills are empowering. Thinking better can lead to better decisions. The problem is, these skills are really difficult to learn, and they're really difficult to teach. And they're overwhelming to put into practice. So you're faced with a new claim, one that you've not seen before. Where do you start? The Foundations of Science course originally used James Lett's Field Guide to Critical Thinking from Skeptical Inquirer in 1990, and it's a great toolkit. Most of my students, though, weren't born until after the millennium, and so today's misinformation landscape is a little bit different. So I developed a toolkit that I call Floater. And Floater is an acronym that stands for falsifiability, logic, objectivity, alternative explanations, tentative conclusions, evidence, and replicability. The idea behind the toolkit is to summarize the major concepts of critical thinking and science literacy into a structured, systematic toolkit that helps students to evaluate claims so that they have a place to start and know how to systematically think through new claims. And hopefully it's a memorable acronym. So the foundation of Floater is skepticism, which is proportioning acceptance of a claim to the evidence. And it's an important first step. You have to ask yourself, is this true? Does it make sense? The hardest time to be skeptical, though, is when something confirms what we already believe. If you want something to be true, or if you don't, if it triggers strong emotions, if your skeptical radar isn't on, though, you won't evaluate claims. So if you don't even have your skepticism ready to go, then the claim is just going to bypass it entirely. So it's important to be skeptical. Also, before using the toolkit, we need to clearly identify the claim and define any terms, especially those that might be ambiguous. And as always, the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. They have to provide the evidence for the claim. It's not up to you to disprove it. So with that said, the first rule is falsifiability. It must be possible to think of evidence that would disprove the claim. Most people, when looking for the truth of a claim, try to look for supporting evidence. But a better question to ask is, if it wasn't true, how would you know? It seems a little counterintuitive. Generally speaking, there are two types of claims then, those that can be falsified and those that can't be. So falsifiable claims, it's possible to think of evidence that would prove it wrong. Falsifiable claims are objective claims. They are independently verifiable. They are testable. In contrast, unfalsifiable claims are impossible to disprove. They might be true, but since there's no way to use evidence to test them, any evidence that appears to support them is basically meaningless. There are 4 types of unfalsifiable claims. The first is subjective claims. These are opinions, personal preferences, judgments, emotions, values, morals. The problem is that we confuse objective claims with our subjective opinions. We think that our opinions are facts And we think that a fact is an opinion if we don't agree with them. And that's not what an opinion is. So for example, I always tell my students, if I get a chance to use cats as an example, I'm going to. Cats make better pets than dogs. Right? That's my opinion. And I'm right. I have evidence. So they're quiet. They're self-cleaning. I can leave them alone for longer. I don't have to take them out in a cold, snowy morning to go poo. I have evidence to support this opinion, but it's still an opinion. Now, that particular opinion may not arouse strong feelings, but some of them do. For example, eating meat is wrong, or mask mandates are tyranny. All of these are subjective claims. They can never be disproven. And the point here with the rule of falsifiability is that we recognize that that's a type of claim that is not an objective claim. The next type of unfalsifiable claim are vague claims. These are undefined or unclear. So for example, a psychic says that you have a need to be liked and admired by people. Or sometimes you doubt whether you've made the right decision or done the right thing. That basically applies to everyone. Or crystal healing says a certain crystal boosts concentration, or it sparks creativity, brings peace, it raises self-esteem. All of those sound great, but they really didn't say anything. The power of vague claims, though, is that we infuse them with our own meanings. And we misinterpret that to mean that they're accurate or they're highly efficacious. So it's important to evaluate claims based on what's said, not on our interpretation of what's said. And that's a difficult thing to do, especially if we want to believe. Supernatural claims are things like God, spirits, vague energies, forces, magical human abilities. So science is limited to natural explanations because they're observable. But science can't disprove anything supernatural because it's not observable. So for example, if somebody said that COVID is God's punishment for something, insert whatever claim, we will never know that for sure. That is an unfalsifiable claim. COVID, of course, is falsifiable, but God's punishment is not falsifiable. There are exceptions to this. Any claims that impact the natural world or leave physical evidence. So if somebody says they can read minds or if they can bend spoons or something, we can test that. But the vague energy forces, we cannot test. And then finally, the ad hoc excuses. This is rationalizing or making excuses, often to protect a claim from being falsified instead of accepting the evidence that it's wrong. So conspiracy theorists are masters at this. All evidence supports the theory. They're basically immune to evidence. If evidence is missing, it was covered up. If evidence contradicts the theory, it was planted. Somehow all the evidence that would falsify the conspiracy theory is consumed into the conspiracy theory so that it becomes part of the theory. Another way that's a bit more innocuous every day is the "it's my opinion." Sometimes it is just my opinion, but sometimes what we're doing is we're hiding an objective, a factually wrong statement behind an opinion shield just because we don't want to be wrong. So a few examples. I'm a Taurus. Next weekend is my birthday. So here is my horoscope for today. It says in part, I'm learning that setting certain boundaries does not make you a bad person. You are learning that it's by pouring into your cup that you are able to give from a space of fullness to those around. Be gentle with myself. I mean, it sounds great, but it really doesn't say anything. So this claim is not falsifiable because it's vague. Reiki healing is a type of energy medicine. Now, energy, of course, is falsifiable. It is measurable. It is used in medicine, but energy medicine claims often aren't. So for example, here, it says that Reiki heals by flowing through the affected parts of an energy field and charging them with positive energy. It raises the vibratory level of an energy field in and around the physical body. I mean, these things are so vague and they're appealing to vague energy forces that they're not falsifiable. Supplements are often vague, and that's by law. Supplements are not FDA regulated, and so they're not supposed to make specific health claims. So what they do instead is they make really broad, generic claims like strengthens immune system or supports the respiratory system, right? It supports inflammation responses. This doesn't really mean a whole lot. So most supplement claims are so vague as to not be falsifiable. And to finish off here with one of my favorite comics, we have one of our ships sank off the coast of Spain. Well, Neptune is punishing us for tolerating the left-handed. Now, again, could that be true? I suppose, but we'll never know for sure. And that's the point with this kind of supernatural, unfalsifiable claim. So remember, the bottom line with falsifiability is that it's important to recognize the different types of claims. Unfalsifiable claims can't be tested, so we may never know for sure. And we often use evidence to protect unfalsifiable beliefs that we want to believe. So the key isn't to convince ourselves that it's objectively true when we're able to support it with evidence. We may have evidence, but if it's not falsifiable, that evidence doesn't really mean anything. So we don't want to assume a claim is true because it can't be proven wrong. Okay, the rule of falsifiability. Next up is logic. Arguments for a claim must be logical and not commit fallacies. We hear arguments all day, every day. We make them to ourselves. A lot of anti-science arguments are illogical. Now, logic is a huge hill to explore. We're not going to go all the way down here, but the first thing that you want to do is try to figure out the structure of the argument and that what am I being asked to accept? That's the conclusion. And what evidence is being used to support that conclusion? Those would be the premises. Sometimes there are hidden premises. These are unstated premises that are required for the conclusion to be true. And we have to find those in order to really evaluate an argument. And there's different types of arguments, deductive and inductive. And again, for the sake of time, really briefly, a deductive argument provides conclusive support for a conclusion, whereas an inductive argument provides probabilistic support. Most arguments are inductive, meaning they do not provide conclusive support, yet we tend to be really confident in the conclusion. So it's good to note that we're often more confident in our arguments than we should be. I personally find that one of the most powerful ways to quickly analyze claims is to look for fallacies. These are errors in reasoning. And there's about a gazillion of these. There's way too many to cover, but there's about a dozen to 20 that are very, very common. And once you see them, they are everywhere. So for example, we have an argument here that we should ban GMOs. So that's the conclusion of this argument. We should ban GMOs. Everything else here is a premise in support of that conclusion. So they aren't natural. Millions oppose them. Our ancestors didn't eat them. Food allergies increased with GMOs, and scientists are shills from Monsanto. The problem with all of these premises is that each and every one of them commits a fallacy. So they aren't natural. This is the appeal to nature fallacy. We can't know whether something is good or bad or harmful or not harmful based on whether it's natural or not. It's also worth noting that natural is actually kind of difficult to define. So the appeal to nature, though, is everywhere. Alternative medicine, organic food, etc. Okay, millions oppose them. This is the appeal to the masses or the bandwagon. Basically, a lot of people believe it, so it must be true. But a lot of people have been wrong about things. Popularity of an idea doesn't determine truth. Our ancestors didn't eat them. This is an appeal to tradition. Again, we can't know whether something is good or bad, if it works, it doesn't work, based on how old an idea is. Food allergies increase with GMOs. Now, assuming this is true, this is mistaking correlation for causation. There could be any number of reasons for why food allergies increased. Scientists are shills from Monsanto. A lot of anti-science arguments are variations of ad hominems like this. Like, you're a shill, therefore I'm going to discount what it is that you're saying. An ad hominem is an attack on the person. And for good measure, we have this image over here, which is the greedy looking evil scientist, which is a nice appeal to emotion or appeal to fear. So as a reminder, a lot of anti-science arguments commit logical fallacies, and it's a really quick and easy way to evaluate whether an argument commits errors in reasoning. The next rule is probably the hardest rule of all: objectivity. Evidence for a claim must be evaluated honestly, without bias or self-deception. The problem is, no one can deceive us like we can. Richard Feynman famously said that you are the easiest person to fool. We don't like to admit it, of course, but we are easily fooled. This dangerous cycle here of overconfidence, motivated reasoning, and confirmation bias plays out something like this. So motivated reasoning is the emotionally biased search for justifications that support what we want to believe. So I've jumped to a conclusion because I want it to be true. Confirmation bias is the tendency to look for and remember information that confirms what we already believe. So confirmation bias kicks in, and I find more evidence to support what I want to believe. Because I'm looking for, and I have this drive to find evidence to support what I want to believe, I find it. Look, if we're looking for evidence to support what we want to believe, we will find it. So as a result, I'm really confident in my belief, and I feel really certain. And the feeling of knowing, the feeling of certainty, is pretty indistinguishable from actually knowing. So we just feel like we know something, but we fooled ourselves. Add on to that, beliefs can become part of who we are, part of our identity. And once that's happened, we defend beliefs like we're defending ourselves. We don't want to be wrong. It's not that the belief is wrong, it's that we are wrong. And this is especially true for core beliefs that are really important to us. We also adopt the beliefs of our social groups, and we maintain good standing in our social groups by defending those beliefs. So tribe can literally trump truth. It's very difficult to be objective when our identity and our social standing in our group is on the line. So we think we're following evidence to a conclusion. We think we're reasoning. There's evidence, we're using reasoning and logic, and we're following it to a conclusion. When actually we're acting like lawyers trying to win our case. We've started with a desired conclusion and we're working backwards. We've used motivated reasoning and confirmation bias to search for evidence to support what we want to believe. The poster children for this are pseudoscience and denial. So pseudoscience wants to believe something. So their desired conclusion is, I want to believe this. And that leads them to search for low quality evidence. They cherry pick low quality evidence. Denial doesn't want to believe. And so that leads them to find ways to deny the evidence that they don't want to accept. This pseudo skepticism, it feels like skepticism, but it's not real skepticism because they're not going to accept conclusions proportional to the evidence. They've set an impossibly high standard of evidence. The bad news here is that the smarter and more education that we have, the better we are at rationalizing. We get better at making arguments to support things that aren't true. This pseudo-critical thinking is really dangerous because whereas critical thinking can help us find well-supported conclusions, pseudo-critical thinking actually protects us against that process. So the bottom line on objectivity: be honest with ourselves, which is why this is the hardest rule. We have to look at all of the evidence, no cherry picking, no ad hoc excuse making. One of the better ways to do this is to separate our identity from the belief. I'm not saying that's easy, but it is, I think, necessary in order to do this. And don't play on a team. Be the ref. If you're playing on a team, you're defending the team. You're not being an objective observer. The next rule is alternative explanations, or other ways of explaining the observation must be considered. We often get attached to our first explanations because they fit with our existing worldview, biases, beliefs, etc. For example, I get terrible migraines. I've had a migraine on and off for about a month now. Here is a homeopathic migraine treatment. So let's say that I took homeopathic hypericum and I felt better, okay? It worked for me. So one explanation is that maybe the homeopathic remedy cured my migraine. But alternative explanations asks us to consider other explanations. So we want to brainstorm as many other explanations as we can. And then apply Occam's razor. So Occam's razor is a really useful tool, but we have to be careful because if we misuse it, then it can lead us astray. It's not the simplest explanation. It's the explanation that requires the fewest new assumptions is the most likely. So for example, back to my migraine. It could be a placebo effect. Placebos are pretty good at treating subjective symptoms like pain. Headaches go away on their own. So maybe my migraine just went away. Maybe I was stressed, and when the source of the stress went away, my migraine goes away. Maybe I was hungry and I ate, or I was sleepy and I got some sleep. Maybe I had chocolate and the effects of the chocolate were off, right? All of those things could have led to the migraine, and they could have then led to my migraine going away. Now, St. John's, this hypericum here is St. John's wort. And the premise of homeopathy is that by diluting something until there's basically none of it left, it becomes stronger because the water remembers the treatment that was in it. So this hypericum is diluted 30C, which means 10 to the minus 60. It would require giving about 2 billion doses per second to 6 billion people for 4 billion years to deliver a single molecule to any patient. Meaning, maybe St. John's wort is effective for treating migraines, but there's no St. John's wort in this treatment. There's nothing in homeopathy. It would be impossible for homeopathy to treat my migraine. So I need to consider other explanations for why my headache might have gone away, not jump to the first one. The next rule is tentative conclusions. So a common misunderstanding about science is that it provides certainty, but science doesn't provide certainty. Conclusions are always tentative. Science is more of a process of reducing uncertainty. So this figure here, we've got no clue. Our hypothesis is our initial explanation. And as we gather more evidence, our certainty in that hypothesis is increased. So we do become more certain in that hypothesis to the point where we can elevate it to a theory, but we stop short of absolute proof. We never get to absolute proof in science. The theory is as close as we get. This is one of those terms that in everyday language means something drastically different than it does in science. When scientists use the word theory, so for evolutionary theory or germ theory or cell theory or gravity, it doesn't mean, do we know? I don't know. It means this is absolutely the most supported explanation that we have, but could we be wrong? Sure. So we want to provisionally accept conclusions that are supported by the evidence, but keep in mind that there's a chance that we're wrong. We want to leave ourselves open to changing our minds with evidence. I hear people say this where, scientists are always changing their minds. I can't figure out why that's a bad thing. Why is changing our mind with evidence a bad thing? It also doesn't mean we don't know anything. When scientists say the evidence currently suggests that this, it doesn't mean we're not sure at all. It means this is the best that we currently have based on the evidence. So we want to accept the claims proportional to the evidence. Now, a common strategy of science denial is to demand an impossible expectation of proof. The science isn't settled. Vaccines aren't 100% safe. Climate models aren't 100% certain. Well, you had the vaccine and you still caught COVID, right? Demanding these levels of proof is misinterpreting, I think, what is one of the best characteristics of science, which is its humility and its willingness to change its mind with evidence. So the lessons here, be comfortable with ambiguity, with not yes or no, absolutely or not at all. Avoid being 100% certain in what you think is true, and don't demand absolute proof before accepting a scientific conclusion. The next rule is evidence. So the evidence for a claim must be reliable, comprehensive, and sufficient. So evidence gives us reasons to accept a claim. The more and better the evidence, the more justified we are in accepting a claim. The first part is reliability. How first was the evidence collected? So science is reliable, partly because it's a systematic way of collecting and evaluating evidence. This evidence pyramid here is for health studies, and it shows the weakest forms of evidence at the bottom and the strongest at the top. So at the very bottom are things like case reports, which are basically like a glorified anecdote. And then we have animal and petri dish studies. And then we have epidemiological observational studies, and then randomized control trials. Those are the ones that blind with placebos, hopefully. And then at the top, we have meta-analyses and systematic reviews. And those are the ones that put together all the pieces. So if you think about different studies as varying in the quality of evidence they provide and the type of evidence they provide, and that each study is a piece of the puzzle, the stuff at the top, the meta-analyses and the systematic reviews, put the pieces together, which is why they provide the best, most reliable form of evidence. What was the source? Was it a peer-reviewed journal? Was it a good one? Was it a newspaper? Was it a random YouTube video? Was it just scrolling around on social media with no source? Did it come from an expert? Just some random person? And then what's the expert consensus? So the expert consensus for non-experts is the most reliable form of knowledge. Experts have already evaluated the evidence, and they're going to do a better job of it than someone who doesn't understand how the evidence was collected. So first is reliability. Next is comprehensiveness. What does the body of evidence say? I love this meme here. It does such a great job of making the point. Basically, it's making the point, the case that water is dangerous, right? 100% of serial killers have admitted to drinking water, or everybody who's drowned in water. So if I wanted to make the case that water is bad, here's an argument for it, but it's not looking at the big picture, right? Water, liquid water, is required for all life as we know it. We can cherry pick evidence to make any point that we want to make. What we want to do is look at the body of evidence. Along those lines, be really wary of single studies. So a headline that says a new study says, or a shocking breakthrough, or the single study syndrome. You can find a scientific study that says about anything. I see a lot where people will go online with something they already believe, and confirmation bias will drive them to put into Google Scholar the search terms to lead them to an evidence, a study that says what they want it to say. They don't evaluate the quality of the evidence. They don't evaluate whether it's been replicated or what the rest of the body of evidence says, but they have a scientific study that says something. I actually think this is why Google Scholar could be a bit dangerous if you don't know what you're doing and don't have a good handle on your own biases. So, comprehensiveness. What does the body of evidence say? And then sufficient. First, we want to proportion acceptance to the evidence. Sagan used to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And anecdotes are never sufficient. Let me give you just a little ghost story. I saw a ghost when I was a kid. I remember sleeping, I don't know how old I was. My grandma had come to stay and she was sleeping in the bed next to me. And I felt something hold me down, like a cold hand hold me down. And I couldn't move and I couldn't breathe. And then I felt like a fingernail go up my arm. I was terrified. I tried to yell at my grandma to wake her up, to help me, and I couldn't. I couldn't do anything. It was absolutely terrifying. I never saw that ghost again, but I have had that experience since then. Turns out it's sleep paralysis. And sleep paralysis, if you don't know what it is really frightening. By the way, my ghost looked an awful lot like Disney witches. What the brain does is it's trying to make sense of what's happening. And so it provides explanations based on what it already knows. In my child brain, the scariest thing it could come up with was a Snow White witch. Other people have come up with alien abductions or demons, any number of things. But this is why anecdotes aren't sufficient. We relate stories. If I just told you that ghost story and didn't tell you the punchline, then I might leave people with the thought that, ghosts are real. I saw one. We trust our experience. We trust the stories that we hear from people, but anecdotes aren't reliable. We can easily misperceive our experiences. That homeopathic hypericum that cured my migraine can't treat my migraine. That was probably a placebo effect or something else. They're not controlled. People can lie, right? There are all kinds of reasons that anecdotes are not sufficient evidence. I suppose one of the best examples of this recently is this Nicki Minaj tweet that went viral for obvious reasons. All kinds of people have stories for why they're not going to get the vaccine because they heard somebody get a vaccine and then something terrible happened. Assuming this guy is telling the truth, which is a big assumption, there's any number of reasons that might explain his symptoms. The vaccine is not one of them. Even something like seeing Bigfoot or seeing ghosts, or in this case, seeing a UFO. This is actually a video of UFO. In 2012, over Denver, there was footage from somebody's home camera during the middle of the day that was capturing a UFO flying overhead. And the mystery finally was solved in that it was insects. But we can easily fool ourselves into seeing things that are not real. This is why anecdotes are not sufficient. And the last rule is replicability. The evidence for a claim should be able to be repeated. Nature is consistent, and our goal with science is to try to understand nature. So our results should be consistent as well. If they're not, something is wrong. We've made a mistake, somebody's lying, right? So we want to look into that more. A great example of this is Andrew Wakefield, who in 1998 published a study in the journal Lancet that found a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And this is what started the ongoing concern about the link between vaccines and autism. The problem is that countless studies with millions of children since then have disproven the link. And it's been found that that was actually fraud. He was lying. He was paid to find a link. He had some vested interests. Nevertheless, fraud is obviously a really big deal. So the study has been retracted. The rule of replicability is foundational to the self-correcting nature of science. It helps to protect us against coincidence, error, and fraud. So this is the danger of a single study. In contrast, we have more confidence in conclusions that have been replicated independently with multiple studies, and when evidence converges from independent lines of evidence. So, for example, we have climate change. The Earth warming is supported with thousands of studies, multiple lines of evidence, and is about as settled as science gets. When science is this supported, it's the basis for what we consider established scientific knowledge and strong scientific consensuses. So Floater, the toolkit to help summarize critical thinking and science literacy. I want to take you back, if I might, to the board students I had at the beginning. I will admit that some of them are probably still a little bit bored, but the vast majority aren't. And they say things like, on the left here, somebody was actually teaching their son how to debunk some of the anecdotes on ghost adventures, or what skepticism really is and how powerful it is, and the implications to not being skeptical and not thinking critically. I actually had one student call their mom in the middle of class, his mom in the middle of class, to tell her about supplements. I had another recently that was really excited to tell their girlfriend what they were learning about astrology. Floater was my attempt to summarize and organize the concepts of critical thinking and science literacy to help evaluate claims. Critical thinking is really difficult, and it doesn't come naturally. It has to be learned, but there is harm from being fooled, so it is worth it. I will also say that this is part of a larger effort. I covered in about 45 minutes what takes me about a semester to cover, with lots and lots of practice, to get students really comfortable with something like this so that it becomes more second nature to them. So just want to end with, if you want to find me online, as special thanks here. I also want to thank Skeptical Inquirer and the Center for Inquiry for the invitation, especially Barry Carr and Bertha, if you are there.
I am indeed. And I now have decided what I am teaching that last week of school. I'm going to do this. Right? I mean, this is kind of part of the science curriculum anyway, but I love the way you're presenting it. So everybody, this is the magazine of the Center for Inquiry, Skeptical Inquirer, sorry. And this is the issue with our guest speaker today. Starts on page 45. And of course, we have these webinars every 2 weeks. So please keep an eye out for the next one. Melanie, you have some pretty good questions and some comments. Wow, where do I begin? Lots of good stuff here. So a couple people asked this. So let me ask, are there any books you'd recommend for further reading on critical thinking?
Yeah, actually, the book I recommend for my students, if they want to buy a book, is Stephen Novella's et al. Skeptics Guide to the Universe. I always recommend Demon Haunted World, Carl Sagan.
It's by my bed right now, my bedside.
Guy Harrison has some wonderful books as well, Think. Yeah, there's lots of really great ones.
I like this question a lot from Sarah Hood. You mentioned many people don't trust, and you fill in the blank with the news or science or government. What are your thoughts on how the scientific community can gain these people's trust?
Yeah, that's a really hard thing.
It really is.
I don't think most people realize how much of what we know comes down to trust. I think they like to fashion themselves as independent thinkers, and oftentimes that just means cutting themselves off from reliable sources of information. And there's been concerted efforts, I think, in the parts of various forces in the United States in particular to try and break trust. And some of it is, inflicted, but others aren't. How to regain that trust, I don't really know. I mean, my focus obviously is at the education level and trying to, basic epistemology and critical thinking and metacognition, and trying to get people to understand why science is reliable, why good journalism is reliable, for example. But at a systemic level, if I could only answer that question, I don't know.
I agree with you on that one. This has been asked by more than one person too. How do you think teachers should launch lessons on skepticism and critical thinking in younger grades, elementary school, say 3rd grade, and up from there?
Well, that is not my wheelhouse. I will say something that I do that I think is probably applicable to younger students. I love using pseudoscience in class. I directly bring in pseudoscience. There's a great Carl Sagan quote, and I'm going to paraphrase him a little bit, but it's something like, if we teach people only the findings of science, no matter how interesting and useful they may be, without teaching them the method, then how is anyone to know the difference between science and pseudoscience? And so I actually took them literally, and I use pseudoscience. I teach homeopathy, I teach astrology, I teach Bigfoot, I teach, next week we're doing Herbalife. So forms of pseudoscience that students connect with, that give them, that they're interested in, that helps engage them, that they can then start to understand how the process of knowing there is different than a scientific way of looking at the world. Something else that I think is really powerful is, it's called inoculation theory, which is applying the concept of vaccines, but to knowledge. So by exposing people to bits of misinformation, in the real world, they're able to fight off that misinformation. And there's different kinds of inoculation theory. There are games that use inoculation theory, like I used Cranky Uncle in there. There's Get Bad News for fake news. I'm a huge fan of using active inoculation, in which students actually create misinformation. So at whatever age level is appropriate for them, having them create, like my students create fake pseudoscience health ads. I teach them how to make conspiracy theories. I teach them how to cold read like psychics. I teach them how to argue using logical fallacies. And so by doing that, they get to be an active participant, and they get to be inoculated against the misinformation.
Also, I'm including in the chat there for everyone, the Center for Inquiry is relaunching their Young Skeptics program. We still have some building to do, but there are a lot of lessons there that are available for the younger audience. Gary asks, how long did it take you to put it all together and develop it into this acronym, this Floater program?
Floater probably took me a good year of thinking, and then several months of trying to come up with a good acronym. Yeah, the acronym needed to be sticky.
Yeah,
and memorable.
And it's as being like a life preserver, it's a great idea, Yeah. Okay, so have you heard of the book? This is from Ray, a book from many years ago called The Art of Deception by Nicholas Capaldi. It was written from the point of view of the tactics of argument. No?
No, but I feel like I should.
How about Mike Caulfield's SIFT method? SIFT.
That rings little bells in the back of my brain, but that's all I've got right now.
We've got Lisa asking, could you please address why religious practices, prayer, yoga, and meditation, for instance, cannot be tested via the scientific method? Well, that's the falsifiability thing, right? You can't really prove religion wrong.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that some of them can be and some of them can't. So it's singling out each claim and addressing it for what it is. So for example, if the claim is that yoga helps with relaxation, right? That is probably testable. If the claim is that, what were some of the other ones in there?
Like religion, meditation, prayer.
Yeah, and like prayer has actually been tested.
Yeah.
The federal government actually had, if I remember right, I think there was an NIH grant to fund if prayer helped with healing, and it didn't. But so some of these claims can be tested, and so it's making sure that we sort of tease out each one and address it for what it is.
One by one. Actually, I think in some cases the prayer, they were heart patients and it made them worse because I think they felt pressure to improve and it actually gave them stress. Yeah. Lou Blasquez asks, in using logic, many times I need reliable information and that's my problem. Where do you go for good information?
Well, it depends on what kind of information I'm after. I wrote I noticed there's a lot of people doing their own research these days. And it's often, yes. And it's often in a way, apologies, for usually when someone says that, often, I should say when someone says that, they have an agenda and they're looking to support that agenda. And so I wrote something about that. And then I realized, you know what, people actually do need to find good information. And so I wrote a follow-up that's much more in depth of how to do your own research. And it's basically what a scientific consensus is, the value of a consensus, and then how to find one if there is one.
Gosh, that's so like terrific. Is there, what is it? Do you have the reference to the article or would it be easy to Google?
Yeah, I will put the link in the chat if I can. Yeah, so what I try to do is organize like the different types of consensus based on like, you know, medical consensuses, environmental consensus statements, et cetera. And yeah, I will put it in the chat. My husband's looking for it as we speak.
Thank you. That's that. I can definitely use that in my class. There's something called the CRAP test, and it does something like that too. Where is it? Oh yes.
Yeah. I will say for the CRAP test, I'm not actually a fan of the CRAP test. Because the CRAP test, what it tends to do is it focuses on what's called vertical reading. So when trying to evaluate if a source is reliable, it has you look through the site itself. And so the about or the mission statement, what kinds of content is on there, what kinds of links there are. And the problem is if a site wants to mislead you, they're not going to tell you that they're trying to mislead you. They may even do a really good job of trying to mislead you. So I think it's the Stanford Media Literacy group. I'm going to get that name slightly wrong, but it's out of Stanford. They have popularized something called lateral reading, where what you do instead is you literally open another tab, you go laterally, and you put in the claim or the source, and then you look to see what other reliable sources have to say about it. And yes, Wikipedia is actually a decent first place to go. It is not the end place, but if you want to start there, that's okay. Look at the links at the end and their references. But you know, if they did an interesting study where they tested Stanford students, like professional historians and professional fact checkers, and the only ones that really passed it were the professional fact checkers, because that's what they did. They laterally read.
Oh,
so
Very good. There's a very endangered Northwest Pacific tree octopus. Have you seen this? I use that in class and I have to see which kids figure out that it's a hoax site. I'd like to end with this question because it's been there early on. Dana Grove wrote, I'm retired at 67, worked my whole life in community colleges. She began as a PhD professor in English and ended as a president at a college. And she tried to promote critical thinking aggressively, but was always dismayed to find out that her biggest detractors were her colleagues. What are your experiences?
That is an excellent question. I have been extraordinarily fortunate. To put a little pin at the end of my story, I went to my department and my college, and we had a nice conversation about non-majors science, what the goals of non-major science is. Are the courses that we're teaching meeting those goals? And we removed a few courses, including intro bio, which is kind of like sacrilege for a lot of places.
Yeah.
And so we removed it, replaced it with Science for Life. They have been extraordinarily supportive. Other colleagues I've had around the country have not had the same experiences. And I actually think it's a little fascinating because some of these places, we actually do have decent evidence that you have to teach critical thinking directly. We assume that students pick it up indirectly. Even with like process of science, our science majors leave often with an incredible number of still pseudoscientific beliefs. And I have anecdotally been with a lot of science PhDs, and you start a conversation about what a theory is versus a law.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Right. So like even basic philosophy of science questions, we don't do a good job teaching those things. So the evidence is actually there that we need to do something different, but it's ironic that people who have spent their lives caring about the value of evidence, when it comes to this type of science education and how we teach it, don't always seem so open-minded about changing that. So yeah, I've had a great experience, but I do know others that haven't because of that.
Well, folks, we have reached the 1 hour mark here today. And this, I think we could have kept going. I could have kept listening to you talk and explain those things for another hour, honestly. I want to just let you all know that this is the magazine of the Center for Inquiry, and our guest today, Melanie Trecek-King, is the cover of the April 2022 magazine. And these webinars are held every 2 weeks. So I do hope you will return. And I really enjoyed being the guest host this evening and getting to know you a little better, Melanie. And I know we have some future collaborations in mind I'm really looking forward to. So thank everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and I'm going to give our guest the last word here.
I just want to thank you and thank the Center for Inquiry and Skeptical Inquirer, and thank everyone for your time tonight. I really appreciate that. Stay curious.
Science for Life, that's the course.